My name is Zolly. I'm the artistic director of Carolina Ballet. But the founding artistic director, who has been all of the teachers you've worked with, mentor, and directed us since we were like teenagers, is going to give you a little talk on dance history. So he's the most influential figure of Carolina Ballet. And he is doing this out of the goodness of his heart to educate you during your summer. So I hope that you'll give him the respect he deserves. And I'm going to sit in here and help with a bit. But he's taken time and he's developed a curriculum for you guys especially. So it's really exciting. I'm going to sit here and listen to him share it all. And I just want you to pay attention because this is probably a once in a lifetime opportunity that you're going to get to hear someone with so much history who worked with George Balanchine, who started his own company and knows so many other choreographers. So it's really a great experience you're going to get. So please give him the respect he deserves, okay? And you're on mute, so you can't interrupt. But this is Robert Weiss.
Hi. Okay, this is the strangest experience. It'd be so much better if we were all in the same room together. But anyway, I'm happy to be here and happy to share with you a little bit of my knowledge of the history of ballet. So when Zolly asked me to teach this course, it's a pretty short course. The ballet history is very long. It's almost 500 years if you want to start it with Renaissance dancing. Renaissance choreography was the height of the Renaissance quite a long time ago. Ballet really, the real history of ballet didn't really start until much later, but we could trace our roots back to the Italian city-states during the Renaissance and right after the Renaissance times. When Zolly asked me to teach this, I didn't know what I wanted to show, because you can't just talk about ballet. If you just talk about it, you really don't understand anything without seeing it. I always say, ballet is the silent art form. We don't really use words, or we seldom do, and we're trying always to figure out a way to tell our story without any words at all. So I picked for this first afternoon, we'll talk about it a little bit more later, and then after we see it, we'll talk about it a little bit more as well. But I picked La Solfède. So La Solfède, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to my script here. Ballet is the most complex form of theatrical dance. But by theatrical dance, I mean to be performed by professionals for the entertainment and enlightenment of a public. But obviously, ballet isn't the only expressive form that dance can take. Some of the most popular theatrical dance forms in Western culture are tap, jazz, Spanish dancing, various inventions of modern dance. And modern dance was really invented by individual people who actually had a very personal point of view toward movement and dance. They broke away from classical ballet, and it actually started in America. And there were a lot of people. I'm not going to mention all the names because it's just would take too long. But of course, Martha Graham was the culmination of that, and then her disciples, both Paul Taylor and Merce Cunningham, were also famous modern dance choreographers. Of course, all dance is very, very simple in the end, because you only have you can move your head and you can move your arms, and you can move your legs, and you can take up the space, and you can, if you have more than one person, you can make patterns. But basically, all dance is related to each other because it's always the same body doing the dancing. And it's a funny story, actually. I'm digressing completely, but when I was dancing in the New York City Ballet many years ago, Edward Villela, who was a principal dancer one generation before me. How many people know who Edward Villela is? Can you just give me a little sign if you know who Edward Villela was? Go like this? Nobody. All right. Well, Edward Villela was a very famous dancer in the 50s and 60s in New York. And he then he did a lot of other things, but he founded the Miami City Ballet, where he was the director for over 25 years, and he just retired about 5 years ago. Anyway, he was choreographing a ballet, and George Balanchine came in to the studio to watch him choreograph. Oh, Elise, which one is Elise? Let me see. Is she there?
She might be on the other.
Oh, is there another whole group?
Mm-hmm. She knows him. Good, Elise. There she is.
Where is she?
Hold on. Elise is right there.
Where?
Right there. Right
Oh, hi. Oh, okay.
She knows him.
Good.
Good.
Anyway, he was choreographing a ballet, and Balanchine came in. Does everybody know who George Balanchine was?
They all do. Good.
Yes, everybody? Most people. Okay. Anyway, George Balanchine, for those of you who don't know, was the founder of the New York City Ballet, but he was Russian. And he came from Russia first to Paris. He worked with he worked with Sergei Diaghilev, who had a Russian. He was an impresario who had a Russian company, a company in Russia, a company of Russian dancers who he brought to Paris. And he had, the company was called the Ballet Russe, Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, and it was internationally famous because Paris at that time was the center of world culture. And that was in the turn of the 20th century and to about 1929. Anyway, Balanchine came into the studio where Villela was choreographing the ballet, and he said, "Well, it's interesting, but can't you make a ballet without arabesque?" And everybody, of course, in the room laughed because it's pretty hard to make a ballet without an arabesque. But what Balanchine was getting at was, can't you do something a little more interesting than just putting people in arabesque? He wasn't really actually saying, can't you make a ballet without arabesque? But what the point was how can you make it interesting when after, at that point ballet was around a long, long time, and how do you make it fresh and new and interesting yet again when you're choreographing? And it's really very difficult when you only have 2 arms and 2 legs and a head, and there's not that many ways of moving. That's why all dance actually is very similar to each other in a lot of ways. But nevertheless, it is possible to always come up with something new, and we're still coming up with new choreography even today. I'm going back to my script now. So after various modern dance people made up their own way of moving, and most of it was based on how they moved, and then they taught people to move like they moved, like Paul Taylor or Merce Cunningham. However, then dance on Broadway came along, and that usually used a combination of ballet, modern, jazz, and today, we also have breakdancing and hip hop, and that's also used on Broadway, and those are also become theatrical forms of dance for the public. So actually, ballet really started to take off when there was a king in France named Charles VIII, and he went to Italy and he watched these incredible festivals that the Italians put on. The dukes and the princes of Italian city-states. And Italy was divided into city-states, and France was one country under a king. And Italy, however, had a very creative side to it, and all of these princes and dukes were in competition with each other to put on the biggest show. And these shows consisted not only of dancing, but of dancing, of singing. Sometimes they even had horses that danced. That's called dressage. And then a fantastic meal that went on sometimes for 6 or 8 hours. And when the King of France was invited to one of these, when he was visiting Italy, he said, I can do this even better than these Italians because they all have little city-states, but I have the whole country, so I have many more resources at my command and a lot more money. So when I go back to France, I'm going to show them what it's really all about. And when he came back to France, he started to do that. And then about 100 years later, we had Louis XIII, the King of France, Louis XIII. And he was very interested in continuing this. What happened was the dances at the court became a big part of what it meant to be a nobleman. And the noblemen at the court had to be able to be really good dancers and really good fencers. And the two, of course, went hand in hand because dancing and fencing is with swords, but it's a kind of dance in its own way. And anyway, then he had a son, Louis XIV, and Louis XIV was known as the Sun King. And part of the reason that he was known as the Sun King is because he put on his own dances, and in one of the dances he played the sun. And the sun, like in the sky, that sun. And he also played Apollo, and he made up a lot of his own dances, and he was considered the best dancer of his time in France. And he was really the founder of ballet, because of ballet at the beginning, ballet that kind of resembles what we know of ballet today. It was really court dances, and originally it was only the men who danced. The women were not allowed. But over time, the women also started to dance. I'm going to go back a little bit now, and I'll come back to Louis XIV in a minute. Other cultures have evolved their own classical dance forms, especially the Indian schools. India, the country, there's a dance form called Kathak, and that's also classical dancing, but it's Indian, and they use their fingers, and they sometimes have bells on their feet, and they have cymbals, but it's a very rigid classical vocabulary, and it's taught and passed down from generation to generation, just the way ballet is. And then, of course, the dancers at the Cambodian temples, they also had a strict school. And then Native Americans and Australian and African indigenous peoples all have invented complex dance languages. Every country's history has some form of ethnic dance it has invented that reflects its culture. Actually, humans have been dancing since primitive times, with people sitting around a fire and with the music consisting of the rhythms of two rocks being banged together. They express their feelings through movement. So what we've come to know as classical dancing today started with Charles VIII rather, in Italy in 1494. And we witnessed the splendor of these spectacles that I spoke about earlier. He brought them back to France. And Louis the 13th, who I spoke about just a little while ago, reigned from 1610 to 1643. And his son, Louis the 14th, from 1643 to 1715. And it was even, so the dances were courtly dances, and minuet, and gavotte, sarabande. Over time, they became more and more complex, and they evolved into what we know of as classical ballet today. But Louis XIV, before he stopped dancing, he was a dancer in his teenage years and his young 20s. And after that, he became very fat, and he stopped dancing completely. But he founded both the Royal Academy of Dance, which eventually became the school in 1661, and then in 1669, he founded the Paris Opera, which of course included the ballet company. By the time the choreography was getting too difficult for the courtiers, who did not wish to spend their entire days practicing their technique and rehearsing the ballets, so professional dancers were brought on, and while the nobility continued to appreciate dance, they became the audience. At first, it was only the men, even when it was theatrical, and then the women quickly came on board, and they took their place beside the men. By 1726, there was a very famous ballerina named Marie Camargo, and she made her debut at the opera, followed closely by her rival, Marie Salé, and they were known as the two Maries, Marie Camargo and Marie Salé. And they both, they had a big rivalry. They both had their own fans. They were the first females to become equal to the male dancers. And then 100 years later, in 1832, a third Marie, Marie Taglioni, became the toast of Paris with her debut as the sylph in her father's choreography of a ballet called La Sylphide. And this began the great era of romantic ballet in France, which the Paris Opera was the center of culture in the entire world, and Paris was the center of culture, and the dance was the center of that culture. Just a few years later, less than a decade, 9 years later, Carlotta Grisi made her debut in a ballet by Jules Perrault and Jean Corelli called Giselle. Does everybody know Giselle? I'll go like this if you know Giselle. Great. Okay. And this ballet actually became an even greater example of the Romantic era than La Sylphide, and it's still in the repertoire today. But the reason that it's in the repertoire today is because, so what happened was all of these French, everybody that was, after they retired from dancing and they wanted to become a teacher or a director, everybody wanted to stay in Paris and do it at the Paris Opera. But of course there weren't enough jobs for the number of people that wanted a job. So people went all over the world, and one man that went was, his name was Bournonville, Antoine Bournonville, and he went to Denmark, and he took over the ballet company in Copenhagen in Denmark. And he had a son. His son was named Auguste Bournonville, and Auguste Bournonville took over the company shortly after his father retired. But he first came to Paris and studied in Paris, and he got to see the La Sylphide with Taglioni. And he said, I can do better than that. I'm going to do my own version. And he went back to Denmark, and he hired a composer, and he made his own version of La Sylphide. And that's the version that we know today, because that's the version that was preserved. The Danish people at the Danish ballet were very, very careful to preserve Bournonville's works, and they had great respect for them. after he died. And one generation taught the next generation and taught the next generation. And so these ballets by Bournonville are the closest that we'll know about to what is really the original French style of ballet. And the Taglioni version that was first, it didn't have a very good score, and it wasn't preserved, and so nobody knows what that was. And we'll unfortunately never know if it was just a vehicle for his daughter, but we won't know if it was a good ballet or a bad ballet, because most ballets are lost to history. So Bournonville choreographed his La Solfège in 1836. And Taglioni, going back a second, Taglioni was the first ballerina to go on point. But she didn't really go on point the way we know today, because the shoes were not hard. The ballerinas just stuffed things in their shoes, and then they darned the outside of the tip, and they would go on point for just 1 second. They would hold the pose for 1 second on point, and then they would come off. But that's how it started. And then little by little, they wanted to do more and more, and the choreographers wanted to do more and more with point work. And so they shoemakers developed shoes that got harder and harder, so that actually women could then dance on point. And the original idea of going on point was to look very ethereal, to look like, and all of the ballets in the Romantic period, the sylphs were creatures who had wings and could fly, and the idea of going on point was to give you that same feeling as if they were flying and as if they were lighter than air. And the Willies in Giselle, who were jilted women who were jilted at the altar before they got married, and then they inhabited graveyards where they enticed men to dance. They danced the men to death. The Willies also had wings, and the Willies also were spirits. They were dead women, so they were spirits, and so they also went on point for that reason. But little by little over time, point work became much more not just about the Romantic period, but modern ballets really use point work extremely athletically and powerfully. And point shoes made the women very powerful, and Balanchine made wonderful ballets, actually moving the point work even more complex and more complicated, to take ballet forward into the 20th century and then the 21st century. Hold on. So I'm going to show you, and so we're going to get up to Romantic ballet today, and then next week we're going to do the time of Petipa, which is the time of classical ballet, where classical ballet really flourished in Russia. So Bournonville went to Copenhagen, and Petipa, after a long time of trying to find his place in the world, ended up in Russia, and he ended up in Russia taking the company to great new heights and eclipsing the French completely, and that's when Russian ballet really took over. We'll talk about that next week. But anyway, today we're going to talk a little bit about La Solfège, and I'm going to show you a performance that was filmed in 1986. It's the Pennsylvania Ballet, and it's a company I directed from 1982 to 1990. This television program was made in 1986. It's the staging of Peter Martins. Who knows who Peter Martins is? No. 2, 3, yeah. So Peter Martins was a Danish dancer, a very famous Danish dancer, who then joined the New York City Ballet under George Balanchine. He was a contemporary of mine. He's just a couple years older than me. And he was a big star in New York, but he had a Danish heritage. So when I directed the Pennsylvania Ballet, and then of course Peter Martins became the director of the New York City Ballet after Balanchine died, from 1983 until just a few years ago. But before he became the director, well, right after he became the director, actually, of the New York City Ballet, I asked him to stage La Sylphide, which was his heritage from Denmark, for the Pennsylvania Ballet. And for a young ballerina who I thought was perfect for the part, her name was Melissa Podkasy. Melissa Podkasy eventually became my wife, and she was the founding ballerina of Carolina Ballet. So she plays the Sylph, and the male lead, his name is James, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute, is played by Marin Boiarou. And Marin Boiarou was a Romanian dancer who won a gold medal in the Barna competition, then went to Europe and danced for Maurice Béjart. Does anybody know who Maurice Béjart is? Maurice Béjart was a very famous choreographer in Europe, and he had a company for almost 30 years in Belgium, in Brussels, in the French part of Belgium, and he also developed his own style of choreography, and he died just a few years ago as well. Anyway, Marin danced for Béjart in Europe, and then he came to America, and I saw him in a ballet class in New York just as I was about to become the director of the Pennsylvania Ballet, and I asked him to join the company. And so I often paired Marin Boiarou and Melissa Podkasy together. But this television program, which was made in 1986, Peter Martins chose them to lead the cast of La Sylphide. All right, so now I'm going to read. The story of La Sylphide is fairly simple in plot, but it has great psychological overtones that have been debated by audiences for almost 200 years. James, a Scottish squire, not a nobleman, but of the landed gentry, is about to be married to his sweetheart, Effie. On the very day of the wedding, a woodland sylph appears in the great hall where the wedding will take place. James is asleep in his leather chair, and after observing him, she gives him a kiss, and then disappears as he wakes up. During the course of the entire first act, she appears and disappears several times and tells him that she loves him. James becomes confused and distraught. A witch comes in the house and offers to tell fortunes in return for a little food and drink. She is a dirty and disgusting creature, and she offends James's refined and poetic sensibilities, so he tries to throw her out. Effie, his fiancée, intervenes on the witch's behalf, and she is given a few shots of brandy. She takes up a seat in front of the fireplace, and to James's horror and consternation, after reading her palm, she tells Effie she is destined to marry James's best friend, Gurn, and not to marry James at all. This is the day of the wedding. James, now infuriated, grabs the witch by the arm and forcibly throws her out. There's a great Scottish dance called a reel, in which everyone participates, and then the women take Effie aside for last-minute preparations, and James goes to the other side of the room with the men, and as he takes his wedding ring out to get ready for the impending ceremony, the sylph reappears, she snatches the ring from his hand, and as everyone else is distracted, she puts it on her finger. She drops James's hat in front of him, as if to say, "Come with me." He snatches up the hat and follows her out of the house into the woods. I'm not going to show you the first act, and that's why I told you the story, so you'll know what's going on. In the second act, it opens with the witch and her cohorts, a few other witches, in front of a cauldron, making a potion and putting a beautiful sheer scarf into it to enchant it. We will now see the second act. James is introduced to the sylph and her world and all her sylph sisters. He's totally enchanted. The second acts of all the romantic ballets are called white acts, and although the story is pushed to its conclusion it is always a grand excuse for the majority of the dancing in the ballet. We'll talk more about the story and its meaning and the choreography itself after we watch the film, which we're going to do now.
Guys, how about you unmute yourselves so you can...
Unmute yourselves.
Ricky, you're going to talk for a little longer. Hi. Ricky.
Okay? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. So many people talk about this ballet. It was like the first really great romantic ballet. And the style of all the choreography, the little beats and little jumps and the épaulement, the top, the shoulders, the way everything's held, is very French school. And the French school is the school of classical ballet, the first school. And then, of course, the Russians changed, added things. And then in Denmark, there was a separate little issue of what Bournonville was doing. And then Diaghilev did a whole other thing in Paris in the teens and 20s, and then Balanchine came to America and really made an American school. So there's a Russian school now today, an American school, and a French school, and then many people say also there's an English school as well with the Royal Ballet in London. But this ballet is really the epitome of romantic ballet. If you'd like to see the Giselle on your own, when the course is over, I'll give you a few places to what I think of are the best versions of things to actually look at. But in any event, the story is very simple, and yet it's very complex and it's psychological. And a lot of people talk about whether the sylph is just a figment of James's imagination, because he had a poetic soul and he could imagine this ideal woman for him. And the real life girl, no matter how pretty she was and how charming she was not enough. He needed this ideal image of the feminine to fall in love with. So was she just in his mind, or was she real? And a lot of people interpreted it that it was in his mind. It's a psychological story. On the other hand, a lot of people say, well, yes, it was real. There really was a sylph that he fell in love with, but because she was so ethereal and so spiritual, he could never possess her. He could never touch her physically. And so the witch gives him the opportunity to, with the enchanted scarf, to capture her. But as soon as he captures her, she dies. So then he's left with, he doesn't have the real girl and he doesn't have the sylph, and he's left alone. And some people say he at the end there he died, and some people say he wandered the earth alone for the rest of his life without anybody. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask me about what I said before, or watching what they want questions about the film, or any questions at all about the history?
The film that we saw, what year did that take place in?
I'm sorry, what year did the film take place? When was it filmed, or when did the story take place?
When was it filmed?
In 1986.
Like,
Was the man the friend or the actual man? The man in the thing, was he the friend that the witch said the lady was supposed to get married to, or was he
The man who dies in the end, or who succumbs at the end, is James, the man who falls in love with the sylph. And he was supposed to marry Effie, but his friend Gurn marries Effie. The guy in the brown, he married her because the witch tells him look searching for James in the forest, and he finds the hat, and he's going to tell everybody, oh, I found his hat, and we'll find him. And so then once we find him, Effie can marry him. And the witch says, didn't I tell you you're going to marry her? And the witch says, don't give me the hat. We're going to get rid of the hat. We're not going to say, we don't know where he is. We don't know anything about him. He's gone. So then the witch says to Gurn, go ahead, propose. He pushes him over there, and finally he proposes, and she goes, well, if James didn't really love me and he disappeared, you're the next best thing. And so she marries his best friend, Gurn. But Gurn was secretly in love with her from the very beginning, and James was so much more romantic that Effie fell for James. But the thing is that they were people who led real lives. They were flesh and blood. They understood their life, and I'm sure that Gurn and Effie were going to live happily ever after, because they didn't have any further ambition. In a way, James, he was a poetic soul. He was a poet. He was an artist. He wanted something more. But sometimes sometimes it's that wanting that much more is too much to want. And any other questions? All right, so this is the epitome of romantic ballet. The other ballet is Giselle, and I'll tell you next week, because what actually the reason that Giselle, the Lasso feed comes down to us because it was carefully preserved by the Danish people, the Danish dance company. The Giselle was not perfectly preserved in Russia, but it was choreographed in France. It was staged in Russia. But Petipa, Marius Petipa, who was the big.
She asked a question.
Oh.
Alina. She asked, why did the witch do that to him? But
Alina?
Alina asked.
Why the witch did that?
Because he
threw the witch out in the first act.
Remember? Right, okay.
And he threw her out very unceremoniously. He thought she was a dirty, disgusting creature, which she was. But she offended his sensibilities, and yet the witch comes in disguise as this old lady, but she's a very powerful witch. When she throws that cane away and she curses him, you see that she never needed the cane. She was an all-powerful, supernatural being. But in any event, Petipa preserved all of the old ballets, but he also changed them. So when we see Giselle today, we don't actually know if we're seeing the original choreography by Corelli and Perrault that was done in France just 9 years after La Solfide, or if we're actually seeing Petipa's, mainly Petipa's choreography, which was still a long time ago, but much later than the original production of Giselle, but definitely in the style of the old French school. So I'll let you know a few different versions of Giselle to watch in your spare time if you're interested in seeing them on your own. Next week we're going to go on and we're going to do Petipa. We're going to do the Rose Adagio from the Sleeping Beauty, and we're going to do the Don Quixote pas de deux. And we're going to do the Don Quixote pas de deux with Baryshnikov and Kirkland. Does everybody know who Baryshnikov is? Okay. And do you know who Gelsey Kirkland is? All right, quite a few people. Good. Gelsey Kirkland was also a dancer with the New York City Ballet and then with American Ballet Theater and Baryshnikov's partner. She had a very short career because she stopped dancing very young. All right, well, we'll look forward to next week, and I'll tell you about Petipa and about the Russian school.
Bye, guys. Thanks so much.